G'day, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining us once again for another episode of the Big Bad Brad Show MMA edition. My name is Brad Williams, and every week we aim to provide you with a fan's eye view of the sport of mixed martial arts from way up the back in the cheap seats. I know I say it to you every single week, but I really do appreciate you checking out the podcast, and obviously you have found us somehow. You can find us on Facebook. It's facebook.com/Big Bad Brad MMA. We are on Twitter at Big Bad Brad MMA, and you can also find us on YouTube. If you just search Big Bad Brad Show MMA, you'll be able to find us right as rain. Subscribe to the channel if you'd like. We'd really bloody appreciate it. So it's been another massive week in the sport of mixed martial arts. So much going on. UFC 200 has a brand new main event. We're going to talk about that. We're going to recap last weekend's UFC 197 and the return of John Jones. But first, we're going to jump into some fight announcements from this week, and it's been a great week for Aussie MMA. We've got 3 Aussie fighters in upcoming fights. Well, a couple of Aussies and one adopted Aussie, the first of which is Ben Nguyen. He's an adopted Aussie. He's fighting out of Integrated MMA up in Brizzy with Adrian Pang and the guys up there. Adrian Pang, too, if you don't know this guy, fantastic fighter in his own right. He fights in 1FC, which is one of the biggest MMA promotions in Asia. Some great up-and-coming Asian talent, but also home to some big show vets like Shinya Aoki, Ben Askren fights in 1FC, Brendan Vera, a few UFC vets. So, sometimes you can catch the 1FC fights on ESPN. If you get a chance, check them out. There's some great fights. So, Ben Nguyen is going to be taking on Luis Smolka at UFC Fight Night 91, which takes place in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is Ben Nguyen's hometown. Great fight for Ben. He's on a 2-fight win streak. He's coming off wins. He made a fantastic UFC debut in Adelaide last year against Alptekin Ozkilic, and then also defeated Ryan Benoit at UFC 193 in Melbourne. If you don't know Ben from either of those fights, you'll most likely recognise him from the viral video, which featured the guy with all the tough stickers on his face. He was mad dogging the guy at the weigh-ins, and then he went and got smashed to pieces in about 30 seconds. Ben was the guy doing the smashing. So he's got his next fight announced. He will be taking on Luis Smolka, who is a sensational prospect in the flyweight division. He's 10-1 overall. His only loss coming to former UFC title challenger Chris Carriaso. He's got wins over our very own Richie Vass, over Neil Seary, over the recently retired Paddy the Hooligan Houlihan. Great fight for Ben, and a great opportunity for him to find out where he stands in the UFC flyweight division. A very, very tough out in Luis Smolka. On the same card, Aussie MMA royalty Kyle Noak will be taken on Keita Nakamura. Nakamura, very tough veteran. He's got a record of 31-7-2-1, and he's coming off a loss to Tom Breeze back in February, but he's got a lot of experience, and it'll be a very, very tough fight for Kyle. Kyle Noak obviously coming off a highly controversial split decision loss to Alex Morono in January. I personally think he won the fight. A lot of people think he won the fight, but nonetheless, it'll go down on his record as a loss, but a great opportunity for him to bounce back on a great card. It's shaping up to be a fun little card. It'll take place in July, I believe. Let me just double check the dates for you folks. It will be on July 14, Australian time, UFC Fight Night 91. So fantastic news there. Also, great news for Aussie MMA fans. Our rising prospect Jake Matthews has his next opponent. He'll be taking on Stevie Ray at Ultimate Fighter finale in July 9th, Australian time in Las Vegas. And that is Stevie Ray, the Scottish MMA fighter, not to be confused with Stevie Ray, Booker T's brother and one half of Harlem Heat. Shout out to any 90s wrestling fans. That's shaping up to be a great card as well. It's the Ultimate Fighter Season 23 finale, with the main event being UFC strawweight champion Joanna Jędrzejczyk defending her title against Claudia Gadelha. Also on that card, Ross Pearson taking on James Krause in what could be a fun little fight as well. So this is a great fight for Jake. I suggested after his win in Brizzy over Johnny Case that maybe it was time for him to step up in competition and take on someone like Ross Pearson, or someone of the caliber of Joe Lozon, or even Evan Dunham, someone of that ilk. But I'm actually pretty happy that the UFC has decided to go with the slow burn approach for Jake. There's no need to rush him into fights with big names. And Stevie Ray is a very, very tough out. He's on a 5-fight win streak, 3 of those wins coming in the UFC, and it's a great opportunity for Jake to get straight back into the mix and to fight on a big card on a huge week of fights. It's the International Fight Week with fights happening on the Friday, the Saturday, and then, of course, UFC 200 on the Sunday. So, great opportunity for Jake, and we wish him all the very best of luck. Other fights that were announced this week. for that international fight week of cards, we'll see Irish Joe Duffy making his return against Mitch Clark. Joe Duffy, most famously as the man to beat Conor McGregor, the last man to defeat him up until he was defeated by Nate Diaz. He's coming off a loss to Dustin Poirier, who is an exceptional 155-pound fighter. He was one of the best featherweights in the world. He's gone up to lightweight now, and he's making some noise. So Joe Duffy will be coming back to take on Mitch Clark, who's a very tough opponent. He's got a win over Ally Quinter, I should say. He's coming off a loss to Michael Chiesa, who is no slouch. Chiesa is on an absolute tear and a very, very talented fighter in his own right. So a fun little fight there. Joe Duffy taking on Mitch Clark. Also on that card, it's UFC Fight Night, Dos Anjos versus Alvarez. A fight that was heavily rumoured. As soon as Derek Lewis won his last fight, he said that he wanted to fight Roy Nelson in his next fight, and that has been made official. It'll be Roy Big Country Nelson taking on the Black Beast Derek Lewis. Lewis, of course, coming off that huge knockout win over Gabriel Gonzaga in Croatia. Big Country anyone that knows MMA already knows this, but if you are a casual fan, he's a much better fighter than his record would suggest. He's only won 2 of his last 7 fights. He is coming off a win over Jared Rosholt, but when you look at his record, the losses in that 2-5 stretch have been to Stipe Miocic, current heavyweight title challenger, Daniel Cormier, current UFC light heavyweight champion, Mark Hunt, weapon with a cannon of a right hand, Alistair Overeem, one of the best kickboxers ever to compete in MMA, and Josh Barnett, one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. So these losses aren't coming to tin cans. He's losing to the best, and he is a much better fighter than his record would suggest. I think this is a huge step up in competition for Derek Lewis, and a chance for Big Country to show that he's as good as serious MMA fans have always said he is. So another great addition to a sensational week of fights taking place in July, and we'll keep you posted with any fight announcements that come in the weeks leading up to what is going to be a sensational time to be a fight fan. Even the month prior, I mean, next month, or this month now, as of the recording of the podcast, we've got UFC 198, one of the most stacked cards that I can remember the UFC ever putting on in Brazil. You got 199, which is insane as well, with Luke Rockhold and Chris Weidman on top. Uriah Faber and Dominic Cruz in the co-main event, the return of BJ Penn versus Dennis Seaver, and then of course UFC 200, which is just a monster card, even now officially without Conor McGregor, and we will get to that shortly. But I'll tell you what, May, June, July, it's a great time to be a fight fan. Something. Okay, so let's look back now to UFC 197 that took place last weekend. It was the return of former UFC light heavyweight champion Johnny Bones Jones taking on Ovin St. Preux, a last-minute opponent for an injured Daniel Cormier. We will get to that in just a moment, but a couple of other sensational stories to come out of the night. The first, the rise and rise of Yair Rodriguez, already highly touted as a prospect, a winner of the Ultimate Fighter Latin America, came into this fight with a whole lot of hype behind him against a very tough out in Andre Fili, Team Alpha Male product, and knocked him out with one of the most vicious head kicks you're ever likely to see. Yair Rodriguez is such an exciting fighter to watch, and to watch his growth and to watch him really blossom into a contender is a very, very exciting thing to bear witness to, and he doesn't look like slowing down anytime soon. It was a highlight reel knockout and a great example of everything that Yair Rodriguez brings to the table. He's definitely one to keep an eye on, so don't miss his next fight, and don't blink, whatever you do. Another story to come out of the UFC 197 card, and one that wasn't necessarily surprising, but just another stellar performance from Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson, the UFC flyweight champion. Henry Cejudo is an Olympic gold medalist in wrestling, world-class grappler. That seemed to be his best chance of winning the fight, and Demetrius Johnson came out in the first round and just smashed him to pieces with knees from the clinch, got the TKO victory, and looked like an absolute superstar doing it. As far as the UFC flyweight division goes, it really is Demetrius Johnson and then Daylight. Talk straight after the fight was that he would perhaps be fighting Joseph Benavidez again, a fella that he's already beaten twice and that he knocked out viciously in their last outing. But it really is getting to the point where there's no one else at this point in time. It's not to say that there won't be credible challenges down the line. I've mentioned on previous episodes of the podcast that Jusei Formiga could potentially be a challenger. Zach Makovsky, another one to keep an eye on. Justin Scoggins is on his way up. But at the moment, there's really nobody that jumps off the page as someone that would potentially be a credible challenger, except for maybe Joseph Benavidez, who, as I've just said, he's already beaten twice. There is talk that the Ultimate Fighter 24, if everything goes to plan, will be a tournament to crown a challenger for Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson. It'll be a tournament comprised of all new fighters coming into the UFC. It's a big ask to come in from regional promotions all over the world, as strong as they may be, to win a tournament and then challenge Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson. He is just on another level as far as the UFC flyweights are concerned. There is talk that he could potentially go up to challenge Dominic Cruz if he is successful over Uriah Faber for the UFC Bantamweight Championship. I don't know how that would go. He has already challenged Dominic Cruz prior to the UFC introducing a flyweight division, and Dominic Cruz won pretty soundly. DJ wasn't disgraced by any stretch of the imagination. It was a competitive fight, but Dominic Cruz controlled the fight, used his range, and it was just too much of a challenge for Demetrius to handle. But having said that, he's been incredibly active in the years that Dominic Cruz has been out with multiple knee injuries. He's improved in leaps and bounds, and I think it would be a much different fight this time around. A fight that interests me more would be if Uriah Faber was successful over Dominic Cruz. I think Faber and Mighty Mouse would be a much more competitive fight, and could very well see Demetrius Johnson become a two-division champion simultaneously. I think that a fight with Uriah, especially at this stage in Uriah Faber's career, would be a very winnable fight for Demetrius Johnson. But who knows? We're fantasy booking and a lot can happen between now and then, but one thing we know for sure is that Demetrius Johnson is next level. He is an absolute superstar, and it's been a pleasure to watch him fight, and it will be to watch him do his thing, because he is just sensational. And of course, that brings us to the main event of UFC 197. It did see the return of former UFC light heavyweight champion John Bones Jones taking on a late notice replacement in Ovin St. Preux, who stepped in for an injured Daniel Cormier. The fight went pretty much how you would expect it to go. John Jones came in fairness, he looked a little bit under his best, whether that be ring rust or whether it be just coasting to do enough to beat OSP. Maybe he wanted the rounds under his belt, maybe he wanted to go 5 rounds, he didn't want to finish the fight. But yeah, he looked like a little bit of an underdone version of John Jones, but still plenty to pull out the decision victory over OSP. Reports coming out of that fight was that Ovin St. Preux broke his arm in the second round, which just shows next level toughness and an ability to hang in there against the guy who, in all fairness, was just better. John Jones was a step above OSP wherever the fight happened to go, and then we did find out not long after that fight that the new UFC 200 main event would be the rematch between John Jones and Daniel Cormier. The last couple of weeks really have been a strange time to be a fight fan. With all of the goings-on of the Conor McGregor saga, and would he be in the main event? Would he not be in the main event of UFC 200? Would he stay on the card? Would we get a new main event? It's all just been a little bit all over the shop. The biggest thing, and it was a great article I read by Dan Hardy, former UFC welterweight, and a sensational analyst in his own right, where he said the whole thing comes down to respect. The UFC was feeling disrespected by Conor for him not coming to the UFC press conference in question. Conor feeling disrespected by the UFC for them not giving him what he felt was a sufficient amount of time to train and prepare for the fight. I'm just a little bit... I don't think that... I've gone back and forth over the last couple of weeks, but where I am right now, as of today, I think taking him off the card completely was a huge mistake. Estimates this week from ESPN in the States have suggested that the UFC will lose in the ballpark of $45 million by not having Conor on the card as far as revenue for UFC 200. They're still going to make bank on it. It's a huge card with tons of great fights. There's 3 or 4 fights on that card that could be main events in their own right. But it just doesn't discount the fact that Conor McGregor would bring more eyeballs and more money to UFC 200. This whole scenario feels a little bit like when you're a kid, and your parents would say, your kid's been good this week, so we're going to take you to get Macca's for dinner. You think, you bloody beauty. Excitement's high in the household. There's a whole lot of anticipation. And then one of your brothers or sisters would do something wrong, and they'd say, well, righto, there's no Macca's for anyone. You think, hang on a sec. I haven't bloody done anything wrong. And that's how I feel as a fan in this situation in regards to UFC 200. We haven't done anything wrong. Conor McGregor doesn't feel like he's done anything wrong. The UFC doesn't feel like they've done anything wrong. But the powers that be have decided to withdraw him from the card completely. And there's been a lot of people in the last few weeks that have said, oh, this is exactly like Nick Diaz at UFC 137 when he didn't show up for his presser to fight GSP and they pulled him from the card. Except no, they didn't. They removed him from his fight with GSP and he was replaced by Carlos Condit. Then Nick Diaz was then announced to replace Carlos Condit and fight BJ Penn on the very same card. So he was always fighting at UFC 137. Then GSP goes down with an injury. Carlos Condit prefers to wait for the title fight. So what do you know? Nick Diaz was right back in the main event, only fighting BJ Penn instead of GSP. So no, it's not the same situation. Conor's been removed from the card completely. And that brings us to this week, and just a couple of days ago, it was announced in the States that, as I mentioned before, Jon Jones versus Daniel Cormier for the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship would be your new UFC 200 main event. It's a great fight. It really is. But it just doesn't conjure up the same feelings of excitement that a Conor McGregor fight brings. I'm the first to admit that I wasn't that chuffed when they announced that he would be having a rematch with Nate Diaz at UFC 200. I wasn't really interested in seeing the rematch. I didn't think there needed to be a rematch. I even called it the rematch that no one asked for. But when it was announced, I was still excited because it's still a Conor McGregor fight, especially against someone like Nate Diaz, who brings something completely different to the table. So the story for UFC 200 now, regardless of how successful it is always going to be, well, how much better could it have been if Conor was a part of it? And I can't even imagine the build-up to this fight without the circus that would have been Conor versus Nate 2 and how they would have sold that fight and get him in the same place and give him both a microphone and just let him go. That would have been so much more exciting. I know Daniel Cormier and Jon Jones don't get along and God love them, they're going to sort it out in July, but I don't see this fight going any differently than the first one. I know Daniel Cormier has improved immensely since the first time he fought Jon Jones, but I think Jon Jones is just better than Daniel Cormier. And I'm prepared to be wrong. I'm wrong every day. But I just don't see this fight going any differently than the first one. It doesn't bring that excitement that Conor McGregor was bringing to the card. And as I say, I've said it a million times before, UFC 200 is still going to be a roaring success. There's no doubt about that. Tickets went on sale this week. Bloody hell, they were pricey. I had a look a couple of days ago because I had planned to go to UFC 200. Bank account didn't really agree with me, so that kind of fell through. But there were tickets for as low as $200 American, which is about $225, $250 Australian, give or take. And I had a look the day after tickets went on sale, and the cheapest tickets I could find were $600 Australian, and they were still up towards the back of the arena. So there's no doubt that the UFC is going to make a huge amount of money on UFC 200. But I think maybe a fine would have been a better solution. Take 10% of his purse. Reports suggest that Conor McGregor was set to make $10 million for UFC 200. If you fine him $1 million, you can bet your ass he'd be there at the next press conference. But I think it's a situation of the UFC cutting off the nose just to spite their face, and I think they've made a huge mistake in taking Conor McGregor off UFC 200. And reports have also suggested that they're not going to allow Conor to fight at UFC 205 in New York, which I think, again, is a huge mistake. Dana White suggested that he would fight at either 201, 202, or 203, which are all cards set to take place before the New York card in November. I think for your first show in New York City at Madison Square Garden, it needs to be as big as it can possibly be, and it doesn't get any bigger than Conor McGregor. There is talks that the main event will feature Ronda Rousey fighting the winner of Miesha Tate and Amanda Nunes. I've said it before, and I'll continue to say it, I have no interest in seeing that fight. I don't think Ronda should fight for the belt in her first fight back. She's coming off a devastating knockout loss to Holly Holm. We've seen her fight Miesha twice before. If Amanda Nunes pulls off the upset at UFC 200, she's got zero history with Ronda. I don't think the UFC can rely on particularly a Ronda Rousey versus Amanda Nunes fight to create the first impression that they're after at Madison Square Garden in New York City. I think Conor McGregor would be the perfect person to have headlining that card, leading the promotional charge. I think it's a huge mistake. I think there's, it's a situation that's not ideal for everyone. I think Conor's thrown a massive spanner in the works by no-showing this huge UFC 200 press conference. The UFC has got to make an example of him because they have been accused in the past of showing preferential treatment to Conor. But you know what? That's just the way the world works. If you work in any business or any endeavor of life, if you make more money for the company, you're going to be treated better. It's the same reason you see CEOs of corporations taking executives out to play golf on Sundays when they don't even know the receptionist's name, because the executives are making a shitload of money for them. It's not necessarily fair, but it's the way the world works. Conor was making the UFC more money than any other fighter on the roster, so naturally he was treated better by Dana White, Lorenzo Fertitta, and the powers that be. But they've very clearly sent a message to Conor McGregor. Just because we occasionally let you sit at the boss's table doesn't mean you're a shot caller. You're still an employee and you'll still do as you're told. But ultimately, the biggest losers in this whole scenario are the fans, and I think that's a massive shame. But as I said, UFC 200 is still going to be a monster card, and there are some sensational fights in between, and it really has never been a better time to be a fan of mixed martial arts, and that I think we can all be thankful for. So with that in mind, that brings us to the end of another edition of the Big Bad Brad Show MMA. Thank you so much for checking out the show. I really do appreciate the support. You guys have been sensational, and I really do appreciate it. Once again, you can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/Big Bad Brad MMA. You can find us on Twitter at Big Bad Brad MMA, and we are now on YouTube. Just search Big Bad Brad Show MMA and you'll be able to find us. No worries at all. Thank you so much for checking out the show, and I will catch you next time.